and welcome. I'm Becca Cantor, Jewish Book Council's editorial director, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today for the second meeting of Paper Brigade Short Story Club. As you may know, Paper Brigade is Jewish Book Council's annual literary journal, and it celebrates the breadth and diversity of Jewish books today through a mix of articles, interviews, fiction, poetry, and artwork. At each meeting of our short story club, we discuss a work of fiction published in the journal together with its author. Today, we're so pleased to be joined by Steven Volynet, the author of Shaare Emu. In addition to Steven, I'm joined by Paper Brigade's fiction editor, Josh Rolnick, and executive editor, Carol Kaufman. The three of us will kick off the first half of today's meeting with some questions for Steven, and for the second half, we'll invite you to jump in. If you'd like to ask a question, you can either raise your virtual hand or you can write your question in the chat. On the top right of the screen, you have the option of viewing the discussion in gallery or speaker mode, so please choose whichever one you prefer. And just a quick reminder to mute yourself when you're not speaking. We've also posted a link to purchase the current issue of Paper Brigade with Steven's story, and just until midnight tonight, we're offering you $5 off with the code SHORTSTORY. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Josh Rolnick, Paper Brigade's fiction editor. Josh was the primary editor of Shaare Emu, and he'll be leading today's conversation. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you so much, Becca. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Steven, to this event today. We're so excited to have you all here. So I just want to introduce Steven really quickly, and then we're going to have a very short reading. We're going to hear a bit from the story, and then we're going to jump right into questions. And as Becca said, if you have questions, feel free to please put them in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can after we start out with a few questions of our own. So first of all, Steven Volynet was born in Soviet Ukraine and raised in Brooklyn. He's a writer and a journalist. He is the first prize winner of the 2016 Moment Magazine Karma Foundation Award for Fiction, and more recently, a finalist for the 2022 JF Powers Prize for Short Fiction. We're so excited, Steven, to have you with us today to talk about Shaare Emu, and we would love it if we could just start out with a short reading from the short story. Welcome, Steven.
Thanks so much, Josh. Great to see you. Yeah, this is a quick piece from where Stan, the main character in the story, sees the two window cleaners outside the office building, which sets in motion some of the events. High above Midtown East, there was no ferocious Wall Street roar to any of it. But 4 years later, just months before the one big lie shook the world markets, a small earthquake shook Madoff's offices at the Lipstick Building. Stan would remember that brilliant morning, but not for the minor tremor. He was on the phone with Carmine Corello, a retired sanitation truck driver, when a scaffold with two men appeared outside the windows. Suspended with netting and rope, the rising platform was like a creaky fishing boat afloat in the wind. Somewhere on the other end of the line, Corello laughed about something, but Stan had put down the phone. With swiftness and practiced calm, the man dipped squeegees into buckets of liquid and glided them across the glass in crescent swivels, making the platform seesaw underneath their feet. Stan couldn't make out their faces behind the soapy blur, but he knew that he'd never glimpsed freedom so assured, so elemental. It was the closest thing to flight without wings. Of the 24 traders, Stan was the only one who rose from his chair. He tried to get the window cleaner's attention by pointing to a small dot. Fixed above the playful glints of Midtown towers, it looked like a plane headed directly to the Lipstick Building. But then one of them swiped it across the glass into a smoky vestige. Stan tried to see them better, to make out their faces, but their silhouettes were like two human-shaped eclipses suffused by the late August sun. Could they see him? They worked in tandem as the scaffold rose, slowly but inexorably, until it finally disappeared above the window. Even after they were gone, Stan peered into the empty sky. It took an earthquake to return him to his senses.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. I love that passage. Um, it's one of the things that drew me to the story in the first place. So, look, I would love to just start out. Hopefully, many of the folks who are with us today have had a chance to read the story, but possibly not all. So, I'd love if you could just start out by describing Shaare Emu for us in your own words, maybe summarizing it a bit. What is the story about?
Well, the story about it's about Stan, who we just met in that passage. And Stan is a Soviet Jewish immigrant who was born in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine, and he came to the United States with his mother. And his dad was an engineer who was sent to Chernobyl and contracted radiation sickness and died. And and Stan, when he came to the United States, he tried to just live a normal life, the life of an immigrant. So he got educated, he fell in love and married with a woman who isn't Jewish, and he got a job as a trader. The only problem is that the investment management firm where he got that job was run by Bernie Madoff. And of course, when the Ponzi scheme finally collapsed, it also forced him to think about what it meant to be Jewish. So he had a kind of awakening about that, maybe for the first time in his life.
So I want to get back to some of these themes, particularly this question about what it means to be Jewish. And you've alluded in this answer, I think, to the fact that this is a part, and I'll get to this as well. This story is from a larger novel and stories,
Right.
which has other elements to it, which I want to ask you about in a moment. You also mentioned, and I want to start here today. And your bio says that you were born in Soviet Ukraine and raised in Brooklyn. I just wonder if you could say a bit more, Stephen, about how your identity, that particular identity, and the circumstances of your geography shaped and influenced this story.
Uh, yeah, I mean, when I think about being Jewish, the word identity is actually not the first thing I think about, mainly because it's become so, that phrase has become so politically charged, and I usually think about a kind of essence. And I think the point of geography that informs Stan and his character is the Soviet geography more than anything else, because so much of the discourse around being Jewish, particularly when we think of Jewish literature, rather centered in the conversation about the book being Torah, of course.
Mhm.
And and if you take a Soviet Jew who comes from a state that's a godless, militantly godless state, we're dealing with somebody who is completely stripped away from the book, or even any kind of semblance of a national identity that would be embodied by Israel, the state of Israel. When I was a kid in the Soviet Union, the word Israel, just a mere term, was spoken in hushed tones. So, so once you take away the book, which has dominated Jewish literature for a long time, it started out with the book itself and then worked its way through Yiddish literature. And then when you get into Bellow and Roth, it's kind of fades to the background a little bit, but then it's brought back by authors like, say, Cynthia Ozick, Chaim Potok, people like that. And now it's having a kind of renaissance, if you like, in Jewish literature, Jewish fiction, with people like Nathan Englander, the wonderful Nicole Krauss, that's been on the pages of Paper Brigade. And when you take that away, and you take a Soviet Jew who has no conception of the book, you're in a very interesting territory. I think that's probably what informs Stan more than anything else, at least until we get to the Ponzi scheme.
So staying with this for a minute, Stephen, you've talked about this. One of the reasons I love the scene that you read from is this notion that Stan looks at these windshield, these squeegee men, and sees freedom so assured, right? He sees it in terms of freedom. He sees some might look at people washing windows high up on the lipstick building as a risky job, a terrifying thing to have to do. He's almost envious of their freedom. Um, the closest thing he says to flight without wings. And you referenced this in your last answer. I feel that this is a little bit, in part, a story of awakening, perhaps of Stan's Jewish awakening. I wonder if you can say more about the theme of freedom, particularly as it connects to where he finds himself, sort of this godless Soviet-born Jew in Brooklyn, and what in particular what that scene, why that speaks to him as the way it does.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking that. Yeah, I mean, I think so. Stan is, to me, is somebody who is maybe somewhat more attuned to the divine than some of the other characters in the story. Certainly more so than the other 24 traders on the trading floor who notice nothing. And he's the only one who gets up, and he is transfixed by this experience. So, and I think it kind of foreshadows some of what's going to happen next as we move through the story. And his life is altered by the collapse of the Ponzi scheme and having to confront his own past. But there are these little moments throughout the story where he's very sensitive to something, because that's, having no book to recourse to explain what this is, and in some ways really actively avoiding having to think about it your entire life. These experiences nevertheless creep in, and moving closer and closer to the Shaare Emu, the gates of faith.
Really fascinating. Thank you. I want to ask a few more questions, and then I'm going to bring Becca and Carol in. One thing I really just feel I have to ask about this morning with everything that's going on in Ukraine. I know from our past conversations that you're from Kharkiv. Your parents, I know you've shared with us, feel a very strong personal connection to the city. I know you came here when you were young. But I have to ask sort of how this moment is landing for you. And in particular, I'm curious, it's in some ways, this is a tough question to be asking at a time like this. But I'm curious how you sort of see the role of literature and storytelling, books and art, especially now, especially at a moment like this.
Well, myself personally, the images that have been trickling through to us, some of the reports, a lot of it has been partial reporting, but from what I've seen, I mean, horrifying really is the only word I can use here to describe the streets where I was born and played as a kid, being bombarded, and ordnance exploding on these streets. And my parents were even more invested emotionally in that city, who were born there and went to school and to university, and then fell in love and married and spent the greater parts of their lives there. It's probably still sinking in. But about the role of artists in all of this, I've had a chance to actually check out the social media accounts of some of the Ukrainian writers and poets in the last couple of days of this happening. And interestingly, one thing I did not find them doing is posting poetry or fiction or plays. Instead, what I saw was them posting about asking people if you have trucks. Like, if you have trucks, please come to this location, and we have a pharmacy, and then if you can from there, pick up some blankets and baby food and diapers for the people in need. So uh, I think what they understood, and what they're recognizing right now is that we should maybe practice a little moral humility about our own role as artists in all this. You know, we romanticize the role of artists in these conflicts because sometimes it makes us feel perhaps a little bit more important than we really are. But um, you know, in the grander scheme of things, I think the best thing we can do right now, this would be my plea to fellow fiction writers and artists in general, is to maybe use the freedom we have here to be the best novelist you can be. If you're a romance novelist, write the best romance novel you can right now. And I think that the example of showing the promise of the kind of freedom we have here that other parts of the world frankly do not, is probably the greatest act of resistance and solidarity with Ukrainian people. That would be my answer.
So beautiful. Thank you so much for that. So I do, with that in mind, writing the best story that we can write, or whatever our particular passion is. I have one more question before I'll bring Rebecca in, and that is related specifically to the structure of this story. I mentioned earlier that this is from a novel in stories. And I know that some of the minor characters in this story, for instance, some of the windshield washers, or I think even Carmine Corallo. I haven't read the novel, but they have bigger stories elsewhere. Can you talk about first of all, why you chose to write this as a novel in stories, and secondly, the function of this story in that broader work?
Yeah, I mean the short story form is, I think, much maligned form sometimes. But yeah, I mean, there's something beautiful about the fractured structure of a book where the stories connect as a larger whole, but could also hold up on their own in a place like Paper Brigade, and give people maybe a quicker, satisfying read, start to finish. Just as in the story itself, you have a kind of bipartite structure where something happens in the middle that marks an inflection point. And so there's Stan's life before the Ponzi scheme, before he loses his job, before he gets divorced, and there's life, the beginning of a different kind of life after. And so this story too appears in the middle of the book, and it's you could think of it as a kind of maybe like a kind of train depot where trains are coming in and are then rerouted in different directions. And so all the characters that you just mentioned are kind of in this story, something happens to them, and then their paths, their life choices, and what happens to them, how they confront history, is also rerouted in the different directions. So, and of course, all these characters end up taking these different paths, including Stan, actually.
I love the metaphor of the central train station. That's how the story felt in some ways reading it, and also that idea of the beauty of the fractured structure really speaks to me as well. Why don't we bring in Becca for a question, and then Carol will go to you. Let's start with Becca.
Sure, thanks so much, Josh. Stephen, I'm kind of wondering, at a certain point in your story, Stan refers to Madoff's one big lie. And from speaking with you, I know that there's several different connotations to that phrase. I wonder if you could elaborate on some of those nuances.
Yeah, sure. Anti-Semitism obviously is one of the themes that run through the story, and to some of the more sophisticated Jew haters, they'll recognize that phrase, one big lie, from finding it kind of tucked away in Mein Kampf, in Hitler, actually. And of course, he refers to World War I and how Jews orchestrated the war and how this is part of one big lie. It is also something that Madoff says verbatim when he's finally confronted with incontrovertible evidence against him. He says, yes, he admits that this was all just one big lie. But there's a larger, more personal way in which this idea of a big lie touches on every character. Madoff, of course, attempts to pull one over on investors, and so he perpetrates a big lie, and then Stan, the main character, is there is a kind of denial about maybe hoping to live out the rest of your life and never really think about what it means to be a Jew ever. And of course, that lie is shattered. Carmine Corallo, in the story, he's merely a retired he's a retired trash collector, and beyond the story, he's actually a lot more than that. He's lived a life of crime. He's not a violent man, but he's been part of organized crime, and in the 1980s, the commission trials and mafia effectively, and he ends up kind of useless and not knowing what to do. So he decides to invest whatever money he was able to save, his nest egg, in this scheme, this Ponzi scheme. And that too turns out to be, a big lie, to think that you could take your ill-gotten gains and just turn your life around overnight and, and pocket the profit. So, and even somebody like Elizabeth marries Stan, who's Jewish. She loves him, obviously, and he loves her. But that relationship really flowers and is wonderful as long as Stan is not, very, very different from everybody else. And of course, we all know that to be a Jew is to be different, not better or worse, but different. And of course, when that difference, surfaces and becomes apparent, when he finally effectively it's starting to become a Jew, something happens and there's a rift, and the marriage. So something happens that precipitates the end of the marriage. So that this is something that runs through the whole story, and maybe even this is something I thought about in the last I don't know, maybe a few months or so, that even we, the American jury, have been engaged in a kind of lie ourselves, thinking that we were completely untouchable here in the United States. And of course, the events of the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, New Jersey, upstate, and Colleyville, Texas, the spat of really violent attacks on the Jews have also shattered that larger lie that I think we've also indulged for way too long.
Thank you, Steven. And just before we go to Carol, I want to remind everyone, if you have a question, please put it in chat. We will have a few minutes at the end to take your questions. Anything about the story or anything that Steven has said, please go ahead and write it in chat. Carol, over to you.
Steven, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Stan's state of mind and spirit at the end of the story. When, he's in his mother's apartment with you take over from here. I'm so curious about what you have to say.
Thank you, Carol, so much for asking that. Yeah, I'd have to go back to the big lie question that Becca asked to explain this one. Yeah, I mean, I think that lie has been a kind of performance. Stan has been performing maybe his entire life. Uh, that the idea that he could fully dissolve into American life and not be different has been a kind of performance. And this is also perennial in Jewish literature, particularly Jewish American literature. Um, it's something that Philip Roth comes up again and again. Um, and maybe that final scene is his last performance. There's no more audience. There's nobody left. It's just him. And that TV, which is another recurrent image throughout the story, the mediating force of a lot of our lives, the idiot box that we watch a lot, is broken. And there's nothing. It's just him, and he is a Jew. So I think that's probably the best way I could explain that final outburst that he experiences.
So, Stephen, we have a question coming in right now on that final scene from Nancy Alderman. Is the smashed TV at the end of the story broken by his mother from the beginning of the story, or is it newly broken in that scene by Stan?
No, the TV is broken by the mother in the beginning of the story. Thank you for that question. Yeah, and the TV is, as I said, is something that, in fact, I think appears 3 times in the story. So it's in the beginning when the mother smashes it. Stan's mother, of course, suffers dementia. She eventually he's forced to put her in a nursing home. He can no longer take care of her, and he takes over her apartment. And then the TV appears again in the middle of the story when he and Elizabeth have a fight over what they see being done to Madoff. Madoff, of course, says they see him being hounded by and harassed by reporters, and they have a fight about what that means. And then finally, we have a TV in the end. Where it's still broken, and he realizes that he's talking to a broken TV, effectively talking to himself. There's no one to please anymore. There's no one to explain things anymore. There's no need to explain himself to anybody. It's over. It's just him by himself and his newfound Jewish consciousness.
Terrific. Thank you for that. So we do have a few questions. The first one actually that came in was from Erica Dreyfus. Hi, Erica, and thank you. This was a question for me, which I'm going to answer briefly before pivoting. But she asked what stood out to me as the fiction editor about the story when it first came in. And I want to take this opportunity to give you some props, Stephen, but also because we're always looking for wonderful stories at Paper Brigade. This story, I think you did an incredible job, Stephen, capturing New York City in that sort of late 2008, 2009 time period. And I read it at a time early in the pandemic when New York City had suffered such a setback with COVID. And this story brought the city back to life for me in such a powerful way, from the Starbucks at Brighton Beach to you mentioned the nursing home, with sort of the distant sea view on Coney Island, to meeting in Midtown in the Dunkin' Donuts, and these characters felt very of New York City. From the Carmine Corallo, the Sandman guy who's invested $150,000, his everything he owns and all of his friends and family with Bernie Madoff through Stan. This interfaith marriage. These characters felt truly of this place, and it was just like, and those squeegee windshield wipers, hundreds of feet in the air cleaning windows. New York came through to me in this story in such a beautiful and palpable way. And then the other thing I would say is that I look for stories where characters really yearn, and Stan is one of them. Not only in his marriage, but the way he has this moral culpability of the stain of Bernie Madoff on his shoulders, the burden of that, and what to do with that is just a fascinating place to find a character situated. What can you do? What agency can you have when there's nothing you can do once you've lost somebody's life savings? Is a question that sits at the heart of this for me that I found absolutely fascinating. So those were a few of the things that drew me. Erica, thank you for that question. I want to get back. We do have a few more minutes, and I want to get back to some of the readers' questions. One is about the Nazi ring from Megan Reynolds. I'd love to hear more about the ring inscribed with Nazi symbolism. The ring has only monetary value because of that marking, but what kind of burden is that? What is the legacy passed on with that? Maybe, Stephen, for those who haven't read the story, you can just explain what the Nazi ring is first, and then answer that question.
Yeah, I mean the Nazi ring is given to Madoff by one of the high stakes, very wealthy investment management clients. And he, of course, holds on to the ring because it reminds him of what was done to the Jews, not because he's a collector of Nazi memorabilia. And then when he's indicted, and it looks like he's probably going to have to go to trial and end up in prison, he begins to dump all these things because he's afraid that, you know, if somebody finds Nazi paraphernalia on him, that his sentence is going to be even harsher. So he passes it on to Frank DePascali, one of his top captains, the CFO of Bernie Madoff's investment management firm. And of course, DePascali, who's also looking at prison time, gives it to Stan. And Stan, for a while, contemplates sanding down the swastika and giving it to Elizabeth because he misses her so much and he thinks maybe he'll get her back. And then, you know, there's this moment when he's like, you know, the ring will be worthless if I sand down the swastika because it has this historic value. It's a museum piece. So, it does connect to the larger book. So I will restrain myself from from giving any more explanation, for hope that the book will be a real book one day. We'll get to read it.
Great, Stephen. And this will have to be our last question. It comes in from Elaine Durbach. And the question is, does the unraveling of Madoff's family reflect your sense of his role in the story? And I guess I would just add to that my own question, which is, what if you could finish by saying sort of what drew you to write about the Madoff scandal at the heart of this book in the first place?
Thank you for that observation. Yeah, it's well, so to me, Madoff is an anti-Semite's dream because, of course, he ticks off every possible anti-Semitic stereotype, right? Because when we think about the image of a Jew in the mind of a Jew hater, we think about, you know, the hook nose, the way he sounds, a certain kind of New Yorkness, if you like, right? We think about money and hoarding money and conspiring with other Jews to take money from other people. And so Madoff here embodies all that. And now imagine you work for him. And imagine that kind of history enters into your own life and you watch that on TV for the first time, you know. And so the moment the Ponzi scheme unravels, Madoff becomes more than just a disgraced financier. He becomes a Jew. And Stan becomes a Jew, watching not necessarily the evil itself, but the provenance of evil, you know, engendered that kind of response when he's being pushed into the wall by reporters who typically don't behave that way, you know. And you and I, Josh, discussed earlier. I have a friend, a colleague who's a journalist who actually got to interview one of his defense lawyers, a very experienced trial lawyer who talked about how it was the first time in his life when a client received that much anti-Semitic hate in his entire career. So the role of Madoff is to play with this idea a little bit. I hope that answers the question.
Yep, I think so. Thank you so much, Steven. And thank you for taking the time to talk about Shaare Emu. It's a beautiful story. I hope for those of you who haven't read it, you take this opportunity to do so. I'm going to turn things back over now to Becca to finish off the programming today. Becca.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you so much, Steven. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. This was really just fascinating. If you enjoyed today's conversation and you'd like to read more of Paper Brigade, we're posting the link to purchase it and the discount code again. Our mission at Jewish Book Council is to educate and enrich the community through Jewish literature. We're a small nonprofit, and support from readers like you is crucial to our initiatives. I'd like to encourage you to support us by becoming a JBC member. The next meeting of Paper Brigade Short Story Club will be with Basha Winograd, the author of The Realist, on May 9th. You can find a link to register for that in the chat as well, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful rest of the day.